Good. Do turn back to Luke chapter 7 then. Turn back to Luke chapter 7. How much do you love Jesus? This is really the question at the end of this chapter. How much do you love? Very specifically, how much do you love Jesus? You've got the example of this woman and the poor example of Simon the Pharisee. We're going to start by looking at the backdrop to this whole story. It's a very well-known passage. It's a very well-known story, what this woman does, how she displays her love towards Jesus. We'll look at the backdrop a bit, and then I want to focus in today on what it looks like to love Jesus and what it looks like to love him more. What does it look like to love him more? That was the backdrop to love in this passage. There's a very visible context to this. Jesus has gone to this Pharisee's house for a meal. He's been asked to eat with him, and there is this woman. There's a very visible context, which everyone knows, which is that she is a sinner. We don't know what her sin was, but it was obviously something which had come out into the open, was very public, very well known, and this Pharisee can look at this woman and go, I know what that woman did. This woman's a sinner. This woman has done something disgraceful. This woman has disgraced herself, and she is a sinner. On the other hand, there's also a very visible context of the Pharisees' attitude towards Jesus. Luke has commented on this back in verses 29 and 30, where he's talking about how they received the ministry of John. He says, when all the people heard what Jesus said, and the tax collectors too, they declared God just, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. What's Luke saying there? He's saying effectively they rejected Jesus. John, as Jesus said, is the messenger sent before the Lord's face to prepare the way before him. The Pharisees rejected John, and in doing so they've rejected the Lord himself, who is coming. And so on his side, you've got this very pointed rejection and a neglect. As you read through this passage, you find that as Jesus has arrived at this man's house, he has not arranged for his feet to be washed, he has not greeted him with a kiss, he has not anointed his head with oil. Those would be customary ways to greet particularly an honoured guest, like a teacher who's arriving at your house. And this man hasn't done any of those things. There's a pointed neglect of Jesus, which backs up what Jesus has been saying about the rejection of him. But behind that very visible context, there's also an invisible context as well, which is going on. There's a context of forgiveness, which Jesus draws out through this passage. This woman who's a sinner has been forgiven. Come to look at exactly what that means in a bit. There's also an invisible context for this man of his self-justification. Yeah, he knows that perhaps he's not treating Jesus the way that Jesus should be treated, but he's trying to justify himself, and he's looking for faults in Jesus to justify his own importance as a Pharisee and the way that he's treated Jesus in not welcoming him as he should. And these things come together in this story that Jesus tells him halfway through this passage. We'll come back to what the woman's doing in a second, but these undercurrents that are going on really come out in verse 39 down to 42. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw what happened, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is that's touching him. For she is a sinner. He's going, I was right. I can justify myself here. Jesus cannot be a prophet. He must be a false prophet because he doesn't know what this woman is like. Yeah, I know what this woman is like. He's saying, Jesus has somehow overlooked this. He cannot be a prophet, and he's certainly not anything special. That justifies the way that I've treated him. But at the same time, while this invisible context is going on in the background of she is forgiven, the man here is justifying himself, none of that is invisible to Jesus. is it? None of that is invisible to Jesus. And Jesus turns around to him and he says, Simon, I've got something to say to you. And he goes, oh, yeah, say it, teacher. And Jesus tells him this short story. So a certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, that's sort of 2 years' wage at minimum wage. There's a few tens of thousands. One owed 50, maybe a couple of £1,000. It's that sort of comparison. When they could not pay, he cancelled the debt of both. Now which of them will love him more? And Simon says, obviously the one with who he cancelled the larger debt for, and Jesus says, yes, you're right. What Jesus is saying is this, that the undercurrents of what's going on and the forgiveness, and perhaps the lack of forgiveness, which are there, are actually quite visible. And they're visible to Jesus, and really the results of them are visible to everyone, because that is the basis for what's happening. The way that these two people are treating Jesus is showing what they're actually like. It's showing that this woman is actually a forgiven sinner. And it's showing that actually the Pharisee is a self-justifying man who has rejected Jesus. And Jesus ties these together in verse 47. He says, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. He says, it's obvious, look at this woman, and you can see that her sins have been forgiven. Because she loved much. So that context shows us how important the way that we respond to Jesus is, doesn't it? In this household, at this lunchtime, what's going on here? There are these critical undercurrents that are happening. There's these things which are just not seen by the casual observer, but which are really important to how those people relate to God, really important to who they are, really important to their identity and their future. And Jesus says the way that's seen, what makes that obvious, is how much they love Jesus. How much do you love Jesus? So let's look at this. Let's look at this woman's love. What does it look like to love more? That was Jesus' question, wasn't it? Which of them will love him more? Yes, the one who had the larger debt cancelled. What does her love look like? Now we need to remember, of course, what Jesus said about what it looks like to love him. And Jesus is very clear on what we need to be doing if we're going to love him. That's John chapter 14, verse 15 and 16. And we probably all know this by heart, and we keep turning back to this. We go, what does it look like to love Jesus? Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And then he says in verse 21, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. You can't separate loving Jesus from keeping his commandments. But there's more to it than simply having a list of commandments and ticking them off, isn't there? That's what we see with this woman. She doesn't have the Ten Commandments pinned up on the wall somewhere, and she's going, am I loving Jesus, right? I didn't commit adultery today. I haven't murdered anyone. I haven't stolen anything. Yes, I'm doing pretty well. My love score today is 4 out of 10, 6 out of 10. Let's push it up a little bit further. 9 out of 10. We're doing pretty well at loving Jesus. Yeah, because that's not really what love looks like, is it? Love and obedience go inextricably together. And that's what Jesus says in John chapter 14. You can't take out one and still have the other. You can't say, I love Jesus, but I'm not going to obey him. And you can't be obeying Jesus if you don't actually love him. But there's a lot more to love than that, isn't there? Which we all know. We know that from our relationships with our family, with our parents, our wives, our husbands, our friends. Love isn't simply keeping a checklist and making sure that you do what someone says, or even what someone wants. You don't keep your wedding vows by checking them off. It's like, right, loved her in health, loved her in sickness. We haven't died yet, so we'll keep on going and check off a few more as you go. That's not what love looks like, is it? Love certainly means keeping all your wedding vows, and it means that those wedding vows are crucial to your loving relationship. But you don't show your love simply by ticking them off. Jesus points out three things as he responds to Simon about this woman and her love, which really sets it apart, not just from the way Simon's treated her, but even from the way that he should have treated her. Simon could have ticked all the boxes. He could have been the perfect host. He wasn't, but he could have been. But still, the way that this woman responded and her love for Jesus would have eclipsed the way that Simon was treating him. So I want to focus in on what Jesus says to Simon in verse 44 down to 47. Turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman?" Simon has obviously seen her, because that's what Simon's thoughts have been filled with all the way through the dinner. Jesus says, "I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment." And he says, therefore I can see that she loves much. You can see that her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. You can see how she's not simply coldly keeping the duties of the neglected host. She's not said, "Oh, well, Simon isn't doing his job properly. I'll fill in here, and I'll make sure I'm doing what Jesus needs." She loves much more than that in three different ways. And you can see in verse 44, there's emotion involved. Verse 45, there's affection involved. And also in verse 46, there's expense involved as well. Now, of course, the first commandment, let's just rewind slightly. The first commandment back in, as Jesus calls it, back in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, is this: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might." There's a real engaging there, isn't there, of your emotion, your affections, and the word might in the Hebrew isn't how strong your arms are. It's the extent of who you are, your glory, your bigness, your everything that you're taking to love God with. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. What does this woman do? First of all, her emotion is engaged in verse 44. She doesn't simply bring water and give Jesus Peter a scrub. Her tears are flowing. And it's actually with her tears that she ends up cleaning Jesus' feet. "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she's wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair." Her emotions are engaged in her love for Jesus. God's made us to be people with emotions, hasn't he? We're not just robots who do things. We do things in a way which is happy or sad or glad or miserable or fearful. And our emotions play a big part in who we are, don't they? And they play a big part in how we respond to Jesus as well. You remember in Acts 2, after the first sermon, after Jesus' ascension to heaven, it describes the people as being cut to the heart when they hear what they've done to Jesus. It's impacted their emotions. It's hit them in the heart, and it's gone whoa in their chest. And they're emotionally impacted by Peter pointing out to them just what they've done. They've taken the Lord and they've nailed him to a cross. It's impacted their emotions. Now, this woman, obviously, she has her sin to look back on, which everyone knows about. Everyone knows about her sin, whatever it was. It can be easy to be emotional about sin, can't it? Sin is something which does stir up emotions. It likes to stir up pleasure. It can stir up sorrow. It can stir up grief. It can stir up guilt. But this woman's emotions aren't simply being stirred up by the remembering of her sin that she's committed. Her emotions are specifically being stirred up by her love for Jesus. And that's the point Jesus is making. He's saying, look at this woman's tears. You can see that she loves much. The tears aren't to do with her, and they're not to do even with perhaps people that she's hurt or things that she's done. Her tears are to do with her love for me, Jesus says. What's caused her emotion is her love for Jesus. Now, you may not be a teary person. I'm not a teary person. You may not be a very emotional person. But you do have emotions. And sometimes you're happy, and sometimes you're sad, sometimes you're something else, sometimes you're in the middle. Does your love for Jesus impact your emotions? Because it's very important that your love for Jesus is not simply a cold thing where you're ticking boxes and you're saying, I think I've done these things, which is going to keep Jesus happy. Because then you're kind of back in the realms of, I will do these things, my God will be pleased with me, and I'm sure everything will be all right. Our connection with Jesus is meant to be something much more close to the heart than that. Does it impact your emotions? It should impact how you feel. It should impact how you feel on that scale from sad to happy. Your love for Jesus. And specifically, your knowledge of what Jesus has done for you in forgiving your sin. How does that make you feel? How does it make you feel to know that Jesus has forgiven you? This woman is shedding tears. You don't know if they were tears of sorrow as she's thinking of the cost of what Jesus is going to have to do, or of gladness as she's thinking about her sin that's been dealt with and what Jesus has done for her in that. But her tears show that she's emotionally affected. And tears can be either, can't they? We can't read anything necessarily into it. But her emotions are playing a part in her love for Jesus. How do we make sure that our emotions are involved? Now, this woman she's not doing something to stir up her emotions, is she? She hasn't gone to a disco, or she's not having a party to make her feel better. She's not got together a load of people wailing to make her feel sad. She is simply being with Jesus and hearing what he's saying and remembering what he's done and that he's forgiven her. That's what's making her emotional in this situation. Her emotions are being impacted by listening to Jesus and by thinking about Jesus. And our emotions should be impacted in the same way. There's all sorts of ways that we can try to stir up emotion one way or the other. Listen to very emotional music. Her emotions are simply being impacted by seeing Jesus, listening to Jesus, thinking about Jesus. Does that impact us emotionally? Is Jesus simply he's a cold, sort of distant figure somewhere there in history who might have done something which sort of impacts us? Then it's not going to impact us emotionally, is it? But if Jesus is the one who has died to forgive me because of all those sins which I know that I've done, which have offended him, and yet his love for me has caused him to sacrifice his life on my sake, and that he still loves and cares for me and has today ascended into heaven interceding for me, that should impact me emotionally. That should make me glad, it should make me grateful, it should make me thankful. It should impact me in a way that hits me here and not just somewhere up there. The second thing that Jesus points out about this woman is her affection. Simon should have greeted him affectionately. It would have been a good thing to do in that culture. He should have given him a kiss as he arrived. He didn't. There was a coldness about Simon. This woman hasn't simply greeted Jesus, she hasn't stopped greeting him, is the point that Jesus makes. He said, you gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. As a child, I always imagined her being sort of under the table, but obviously Jesus is reclining on a couch, isn't he? So she's probably kneeling at his feet or sitting at his feet, and she's being with him, and she's expressing her affection for him in this way. Simon should have expressed that when Jesus arrived. He didn't. But this woman wants to be with Jesus. She wants to be with him. And so she stayed there. And she's kept on kissing his feet all the way through the meal. You remember the man from whom the demons were cast out? I think Gordon was preaching about this last week, wasn't he? You find him over the page in Luke chapter 8. And Jesus has done something amazing for him. All the demons are gone. The pigs are all in the sea. And he says to Jesus, it says verse 38, the man from whom the demons had gone out begged that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Declare how much God has done for you." He wants to be with Jesus. He has an affection for him. Jesus, of course, had an affection for his disciples. He wanted to be with them. Remember at the beginning of the Last Supper, Luke tells us later, Jesus said to them, "I've earnestly desired to eat this with you before I suffer." And the word, we have translated earnestly desired. He's saying, with desire I've desired it. He has this deep desire to be with his disciples because of his affection for them. And this woman has displayed this affection for Jesus in a way that cold and self-righteous and self-justifying Simon hadn't even begun to do. Do you want to be with Jesus? See, he a person that you want to be with. See, as you get to know Jesus, you read about him, you get to know more about him as you read through the Gospels, as you think it through, you think through what he's like, you understand more about him. Is he a person you want to be with? Because if you belong to him, you will be with him forever. Is that something you're going to enjoy? Do you have that affection for him that you want to stay with him, just like this woman did? In the meantime, do you want to be with Jesus? Do you love to be sitting down with Luke's Gospel and reading through it and seeing more about Jesus, getting to know him better, getting to appreciate him better, getting to know more what he's like? Do you love to, even when you haven't got Luke's Gospel in front of you, to think through in your head what Jesus is like, to pray to him, to talk to him, to hear again the words that he says, and to appreciate them? Do you have that sort of affection for Jesus? Do you want to be with Jesus' people? Jesus says John says later, you can't say you love the God whom you've not seen if you don't love your brother whom you have seen. So make sure you come to the Sunday evening service, but do you love being with Jesus' people whenever that is? Not simply for fun and food, but for fellowship, for time together thinking about Jesus. Jesus said that in Matthew 18 verse 20, Jesus said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them." That's a good way to be with Jesus. The context there is to do with the church and the discipline of the church and so on, but it's the truth which Jesus presents, that he is among his people when they gather in his name. That's not come to this holy building, but whether that's in your home or walking down the street together or going for a walk or coming here on a Sunday evening or whenever, being with Jesus' people, talking about him together, acknowledging his name together, praising his name together, that's a good way to practice being with Jesus and practice your affection for him. Pray to him, think about his words. Don't just read them, but listen to them. We can sometimes get away today with, because we all got Bibles and it's very accessible, isn't it? We can get away with reading without really listening. And sometimes we don't value quite what we have today. Obviously, you go back 500 years plus, people didn't have their own Bible, and no one had a Bible except someone who lived several miles away, and you'd have to wait for them to come read it to you. But do we value actually thinking about Jesus' words, taking what we've read, listening to it, meditating on it? That's thinking it through and thinking what it means for us. That shows our affection to him, wanting to be with him. The third thing about this woman is the expense of her love, or perhaps the extravagance of her love. Jesus points out she's not simply got some of the oil which you'd use day by day and poured it on his head, but she's got this ointment which comes in this special flask, as you find back in verse 17, this alabaster flask, which would have been a very special flask of ointment. And she's got this special ointment, and she's putting that all over his feet. She hasn't simply replaced what Simon might have done with the customary dab of oil, but she's got this very special ointment to use instead. You have another occasion, obviously, later in the Gospel where Mary at Bethany breaks a flask of ointment and pours it over Jesus, and people exclaim at how extravagant a waste it is because of the value of the ointment and the flask. We don't know exactly how valuable this ointment was, but it's certainly something much more than the customary anointing oil they'd have used. Jesus says, verse 46, "You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment." Her extravagance of what she's done and the expense of what she's done stands out and shows that she's gone above and beyond what might be expected. It's her own personal alabaster flask of ointment she's brought. She hasn't picked up some oil from Simon or borrowed something from him. She isn't sparing any personal expense to show her love for Jesus. Are you extravagant in how you use what you have to show your love for Jesus? That's part of what it looks like to love him more because you've been forgiven more. So I'm just going to read a few verses from the previous chapter, from Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, verse 37. Jesus says, "Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you." Jesus is saying how you give what you have. That's not just talking about putting stuff in the offering box at church, but how you give to others and how you're generous with what you have, and how you give is a measure of you. It comes directly after forgiving, just as in the example we have in Luke chapter 7. It says, "You forgive, and you'll be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you." And this woman is sparing no expense in giving to Jesus. Do you treat what you are and what you have as being there to show your love for Jesus? We very easily get into a way of thinking where this is my stuff, my time, my money, my resources, my abilities, my this, my that. Jesus deserves this, whatever it is, this 10%. So that's his bit. I'll pay him off. It's like paying your taxes, and then this is my bit to do my stuff with. Jesus deserves those 2 hours on a Sunday, 1 hour on a Wednesday. We'll pay him off with that. This is my time to do my stuff with. This woman's view is very different, isn't it? She wants to spend her time there with Jesus. She wants to use her own ointment to anoint Jesus' feet, and she spares no expense in doing it. Do you do that? Do you treat what you are and what you have as being there for Jesus, to show your love for him? So there's these three ways that Jesus highlights that her love is more. It's more. And that her love being more shows that she's aware of just how much she's been forgiven. She has been forgiven for a lot. She says she sinned an awful lot. She's probably done things that Simon had never dreamt of, but she's been forgiven. And so her love for Jesus shines out in its caring for Jesus and doing what needs to be done, but in its emotion, its affection, and the great expense that she goes to. It's really interesting to note, isn't it? All this is directed at Jesus. She hasn't gone up to the temple and gone, I will pour all this out on the sacrifice, and I will go up to the temple where God's presence is, and I will show God just how much I love him because he's forgiven me. Here is Jesus, a man sitting here, reclining here in a Pharisee's house, and she loves him with all her heart. She's pouring out her emotional love towards him. She loves him with all her soul. Her affection is fixed on him. She loves him with all that she has, because she knows that Jesus is the one who has forgiven her. And this is what shocks the people who are sitting around about, and they turn around and go, who is this who even forgives sins? They've just witnessed an interaction between a creature and a creator, with the creator forgiving the creature, and the creature loving and honoring the creator, in this little house where the Pharisee lives. And their minds are blown by what they've just observed. Who is this? Who is this? Who even forgives sins? We don't read that any of them turned round and expressed the same love for him. But maybe it started them thinking, and maybe they began to realize just who this must be. Just briefly as we finish, as she displays this love for Jesus, we have a result from that, which is the assurance that she gets from this love. There's three things that happen in the last couple of verses, which you can glance over, but they're quite important. First of all, Jesus tells her that he's forgiven her sins. He turns to her, having, up to this point, he's been talking to Simon, and he just says a few short words to her. He says, your sins are forgiven. Yeah, that's all she needs to know. Your sins are forgiven. She's already known that Jesus has forgiven her sins. That's why she's there showing this love towards him. But he turns around and he reassures her that her sins are forgiven. She's been there with him, listening to him, and so that she's heard him say, your sins are forgiven. Jesus reminds her, secondly, that she's been saved by her faith. Her salvation isn't because she has come up with a particularly extravagant way of displaying love. Her salvation is because she's trusted Jesus and he's done what's needed to save her. He says, your faith has saved you. And then thirdly, he gives her peace to go on in. He says, go in peace. Three things always come together in that order: faith, love, and peace, or hope. Faith is how she's been saved. Love is this response that's happening in her in response to that salvation and forgiveness. Peace and hope is what she has to take away, because she knows that Jesus' love for her is far greater than her love for him. Is this our experience of Jesus? And do we want this to be more our experience of Jesus? That's the key thing tonight, isn't it? The idea isn't go away and go, am I like this woman or am I like that Pharisee? What we should all be asking is, how can I love Jesus more? We don't tend to put it like that in our culture, do we? We don't talk about love very much. But the important question for us as forgiven sinners is, how can I love Jesus more? How can I show more the extent to which he's forgiven me, through the love that I have for him, and go forward in assurance that my faith has saved me, or literally Jesus has saved me, but I'm trusting him for that salvation. I'm loving him with my heart, my soul, and my strength. And I can go in peace, knowing fully and with confidence what he's done for me and what he'll continue to do. It'd be great, wouldn't it, if we all grew every day in our love for Jesus. And let's pray that we do that, and let's keep close to Jesus, to his word, to his people, to speaking to him as we seek to grow in love for him together.